And as you remember, today is the third Sunday of the month, and so it's going to be an extended homily. And I want to do a little bit different this morning. So at the end of the homily, I want to do a guided visualization with us around Eucharist and around Incarnation. And then that will lead us into our normal question-answer discussion period. Okay. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Eucharistic prayer of the Cosmos. Since infinity is contained in a single grain of sand, we choose bread and we choose the blood of the vine, symbols offered us by the Avatar, the God-man Jesus, and with altered vision we see back into his lifetime as a carpenter mystic, to the mystical core of his message, and beyond that into the purpose of his coming. Even at the greatest crisis time of that incarnation, on the night before he was cruelly killed, even then he could reach into the core of his own being and, using the food of his last meal with his friends, say, "Take this, all of you, and eat it. This is my body, the body which I accepted at my incarnation, the body that I needed for my mission, the body which is the visible sign of the Word made flesh." Remember that. Then, reaching for the cup, he told them, "Take this too, all of you who would aspire to Christ consciousness, for this is the cup of my blood. It binds us together since we all share the blood of being human. Truly, we are blood brothers and sisters." And so it is a covenant between us. It is the final covenant. A covenant to dissolve the illusions of separation. A covenant that opens your eyes to the realization that we are not separate from God, that we are not separate from each other, and that we are not separate from nature. This remembering will take away the sin of living in a state of separation. Whenever you celebrate this ritual, remember that. A word inspired by God. I was just barely 4 years old when I had my first serious row with God. It was Christmas 1950, and I had just celebrated my 4th birthday on October of 1950. And at that stage, I was living with my grandparents, and my closest buddy was my uncle, my Uncle Noel, who was 2 months younger than me. He was the last born of his family, and I was the firstborn. My dad was the firstborn of his family, and so I was 2 months older than Noel. He was born in December of 1946, and I was born in October of 1946, so he's my best buddy. But we had a buddy across the street from us. We lived in a big housing project called St. Rita's Avenue. And the guy right across the street was by a guy called Pat Gunning. And I remember on Christmas of 1950, the style in Ireland, I don't know if you guys had the same style here, the way kids wrote to Santa Claus in Ireland was you'd tear a page out of your school copybook, and then you'd write a letter to Santa, and then you'd put it into the fireplace. There was always a fire burning, and the hot air would take it up the chimney, and it would blow away to the North Pole. So that was the delivery system, and it worked every time. You know, there was no return mail, nobody know, addressee unknown. That never happened. It always got there. So I remember in Christmas 1950, I desperately wanted a gun and holster. And I wrote to Santa Claus, I put my letter into the fire, and it wafts up the chimney. And I declared to God, I come down on Christmas morning with a small little Christmas tree, and there was a gun and holster. I was in absolute the seventh heaven. I couldn't believe it. So I strap on my gun and holster, and I run outside to start playing. And right then, Pat Gunning, who lived straight across from us, comes out from his doorway, and he too was wearing a gun and holster. Except there's a big difference. The gun and holster I had was a little cloth, belt, and a small little tin, revolver stuck in it. Pat Gunning came out with a huge big leather belt, and a big a metal gun with a mother of pearl handle on it. And I'm looking at him, I can't believe it. So I run back in home and I take it off and I throw it, and we had a little crash, knocked St. Joseph over on his ear, And my grandmother and my great-grandmother brought presents and said, "What's wrong with you, child?" I started screaming my head off. "This is unfair. This is not just." Now, I don't know if I was using those exact words, but basically what I told them was, Pat Gunning's father was fairly rich. By Irish standards, he was fairly rich. So Pat had gifts throughout the year. We didn't have anything. And now it's Christmas time, and we both asked Santa for guns and holster, and Santa gives me this tiny little thing, and he gives Pat Gunning that. I thought this was really, really unjust. And we know that Santa Claus is, God's sidekick. So obviously God was in on this as well. And so I was really, really, really upset with God at this. Now, I want to use that today as a metaphor, because I want to talk about karma, and I want to talk about Eucharist, and I want to talk about covenant. And I'm going to use that as an illustration halfway through the homily. So hold that story in mind for a few moments. And basically, I want to make 3 points, and then I'm going to lead us into an active imagination or a guided visualization around Eucharist and around covenant and around incarnation. So the 3 points I make this morning. The first one I will say, this is my body. The second one, this is my covenant. And then thirdly, this is my Eucharist. So this is my body. For the last few months, we've developed the practice in our community here, and I illustrated this morning, that when we come to the consecration of the Mass and we said, "This is my body," we're not just holding a host in the air, we're putting our hands on our own bodies, because this is not just something that is true of Jesus, that this is Jesus' body. This is the body of God as much as this is the body of God. Every single one of us here is a Word of God made flesh. So we've adopted that practice during our consecration of the Mass, both for the chalice and for the bread. Because the realization, what Christ is telling us, is that every single one of us is a Word of God made flesh. And so there is nothing which is not, the body of Christ or the body of God. We are the way in which God, manifests in the physical arena. So in some senses, there are 2 aspects to God. There's the transcendence, about which we can say nothing. It's an ineffable mystery. We can experience it, and we do constantly, but we can't articulate it. And then there's the immanence of God. God, as she manifests herself through her creation. And these are the words of God that have become enfleshed or incarnated. And Christ was such a word. And there's the great passage in John's Gospel, in the prologue to John's Gospel, where it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." And we think this is true only of Jesus. And of course it's not. Every single one of us can say exactly the same thing. And so during the Eucharist, as each one of us, puts our hand on our own heart, and we say, "This is my body." My body is a Word of God made flesh, just as Jesus' body was a Word of God made flesh. So I want to get to hold that in our hearts like that. Then we have to understand that even in the Scriptures, this is said again and again and again, but we keep missing it again and again and again. So there's one of my favorite passages in all Scripture is from Paul's letter to the Philippians, and it's chapter 2, verses 6 to 11, where Paul says, "Have that mindset in you, which was also in Christ Jesus." Because although he was God, he did not cling to his divinity, but he emptied himself, taking on a human form and being born as a servant, and accepted even death on a cross. And because of this, every knee in heaven and earth and below the earth will bow the knee and confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Now, the part of that we forget constantly is the very first line, where Paul says, "Have that same mindset in you." Because you too are God. There is only God. There is nothing except God. I keep saying to you again and again and again, we're living in a nested series of dreams. That life is simply a dream that the ego is having. And the dream is simply, the ego is simply a dream that the soul is having. And the soul is simply a dream that spirit is having. And spirit is simply a dream that source or God is having. So there is only God. There is nothing except God. But there's God as the transcendence about which we can say nothing, and there's God as the immanence which we can absolutely experience in creation all the time. And so that's what Paul is saying. Have that same mindset in you, because you too are God, and you emptied yourself, and you took on a human form. And you took on the vicissitude and the suffering and eventually the death of the human body, just like Jesus did. So have that very same mindset in you. So it's hidden in plain sight all over the Scriptures when we know how to look for it. It is not a question of worshipping Jesus as the only Son of God. It's understanding that Jesus was self-realized. He got it, who he really was, and he acted from that divine space within himself. And he's asking us to come to the same recognition and the same realization. And realization has two aspects. Realization is the cognitive appreciation of something, and then the making real of it. Realization means making it real, walking it into your everyday talk and in your everyday behavior. And so it's hidden all over the scriptures. And so the question we have to ask ourselves then is, in this prayer of the cosmos that we use in our liturgies, when we say, this is my body, the body that I accepted at my incarnation. It wasn't just Jesus who accepted that particular body at his incarnation. It was Barbara and it was Jane and it was George who accepted their bodies at their incarnation. Every single one of us accepted this body at our incarnation. And that's the true meaning of karma. And that's the illustration of myself and Pat Gunning. If every single one of us were born into exactly the same bodies, exactly the same kinds of bodies, like we were like cookie cutters that came out from God, there'd be no problem. The problem happens when we start comparing ourselves. I was really, really happy with my gun and holster. Absolutely. It's exactly what I asked for until I saw Pat Gunning. And then everything changed. The game was changed at that stage. If everybody on planet Earth had exactly the same body that you and I have, we'd all be dead happy. There'd be no jealousy. There'd be no envy whatsoever. We'd all accept that this is what a human body looks like. But we don't, because we have very, very different purposes and very, very different meanings. And the whole understanding of karma is that karma is not some kind of a punitive mechanism whereby God punishes us in subsequent incarnations for crimes we committed in previous incarnations. It's not that at all. It is that we craft exactly the circumstances of our next incarnation in fine detail. We choose the body we want, we choose the family we want to be born into, we choose the culture that we want to become part of, and we choose the particular time in human history that we want to come in, exactly as we want. And we put it on Christmas morning, and then we go out and we meet the Pat Gunnings of the world. And then everything changes. And so that's the first point. This is my body. The body you have is precisely the body you asked for. You wrote to Santa Claus before you came down here. You put your letter into the fire. It went up the chimney, and Santa Claus says, are you sure that's what you want? You said, absolutely. That's what I want. And you got it. So why are you complaining? Why are you looking for the Pat Gunnings of the world in order to be unhappy with life? But we all do it, every single one of us. That's my first point. The second point then I call it, this is my covenant. So in another part of the Eucharistic prayer we says, this is the cup of my blood. It is a new covenant. It is the kind of the final covenant. And we think of covenant typically as Christians. We think there were two covenants or two testaments. There was the old covenant with the Jews, and then there was the new covenant with the Christians. The truth is, when you read the Judeo-Christian scriptures, there are many, many, many different covenants. The very first one, in fact, is between a covenant that God made, and Noah is the other party. But in that passage, it's the world has been flooded, everybody has been killed, all the animals, everybody is dead, except 8 people. Noah and his wife, and their 3 sons, and the sons' wives. Only 8 people survived the flood, allegedly, according to the biblical report. And God then repents of what he had done, and he makes the first covenant. But it's interesting, in the passage describing it, on 6 different occasions, he says who the covenant is between. And it is not between God and the Jews. It's not even between God and human beings. It's between, he says, myself and all living beings. So it's a covenant that God makes with all of life. In other words, it's a covenant between the transcendence of God and the immanence of God. Everything is included. All created things are included in this agreement between the transcendence and the immanence. So that's actually the first covenant mentioned in Scripture. The next one is the covenants start getting narrow. So the first one is between the transcendence of God and the immanence of God, between God as mystery and God as manifestation. The second one comes about 1850 BC, and it's between God, allegedly, a particular God called Yahweh, and a particular man called Avram, his name is changed to Avraham eventually. It's a pun in Hebrew. And so this now is a much narrower covenant, and the promise of this covenant is kids. God is going to make a covenant with this particular man, and he's going to grant him tremendous progeny, that his children are going to become more numerous than the grains of sand on the shore of all the seas of the world, or of all the stars in the heavens. And Abraham, for his part, must make sure he circumcises all the males. So it's like, it's allegedly the first agreement. So it's between a person who will be the progenitor of many, many, many children. And in fact, Abram goes on to be the patriarch of both the Arabic nation and the Jewish nation. Through a slave girl's son. He's the father of the Arabic nation. So now it's gotten narrowed down. It's not between God and all living beings anymore. It's between God and one man's progeny. Fast forward 600 years and you get a third covenant between God and Moses, 1250 BC. And now it's even much narrower. God is going to pick out a single tribe, the Israelites, and he's going to give them a promised land. So another covenant is between a small group and a piece of real estate. The next covenant comes about 250 years later, and it's a covenant he makes with David. David captures Jerusalem in the year 1010 BC and makes it his capital. It's an ancient city. He captures it, makes it his capital. And this covenant is now between God and David. And this time the promise is about a lineage. So it's gone from all living things to a kind of many children, to a particular tribe of people, and now just to a particular lineage, David's lineage, that will rule over Israel forever. That's the agreement. Now at some stage, you have to go 1,000 years before there's the next real covenant. And this one changes everything, all bets are off at this stage. It's not this narrow little thing with a particular, a kind of a jealous God and particular tribe of people or an individual person. Christ comes with a new covenant, and it's a covenant again between God and all living things. And it's the covenant of a different kind of a kingdom. Not a piece of real estate, not a particular royalty line, but the kingdom of heaven. The essence of all living beings. So it's a totally different kind of a covenant again. It's a total shift, a total break in the understanding of these kinds of business agreements between a particular God and a particular individual or a particular tribe of people. And then, for my opinion, as we say in our Eucharistic prayer here, there's a final covenant. And the final covenant is what I call a preconception contract, or a preconception covenant, if you want to call it that. And that's the realization that ultimately the covenants never are between God and people or God and groups. The covenants are always between souls. It is not that God is making a covenant with a particular, sentient life form, human beings, or a particular tribe of people, the Jews, or a particular religious belief, Christians. God has nothing got to do with it, in a sense. The real covenant is between the souls as they manifest. And there are many different levels of this covenant. There's the family group covenant. There's the covenant between yourself and your soulmate. There's the covenant of a culture into which you're born. There's the covenant of the species of which you're a part. There's the covenant of all sentient beings of which you are a member. So there are very different gradations of this covenant as well. So we have to realize then that this covenant goes much deeper than this. It's an agreement between us, and all other living beings. And therefore we have to try to honor that covenant, to live according to that, to realize that there are no special relationships with God, and God doesn't play favorites, and neither should we be playing favorites. That ultimately everything that exists is just another articulation of the divine. It's just another part of God. This brings me to my third point. This is my Eucharist. Now, as we celebrate Eucharist together Sunday by Sunday, very often I think most of us don't have a proper understanding even of what Eucharist is. We think that Eucharist is a kind of a memorial where we remember an event that happened 2,000 years ago. It's not a memorial. So in our Eucharistic prayer of the covenant, there's a statement that says, with altered vision, we see back into his lifetime as a carpenter mystic. With altered vision. And the altered vision precisely is the ability to surf trans-dimensionally and to surf trans-temporarily. So time is merely an artifact of a particular state of consciousness. And when we transcend that state of consciousness, we find ourselves in transpersonal and trans-temporal reality. It is as easy for Deborah or Kathleen Lyons this morning to participate in the Last Supper as it was for James or John or Judas to participate in the Last Supper. It's only a question of shifting a state of consciousness and going trans-temporal. So that's a very important phrase. We're not talking about just accessing some kind of archives of past events and remembering them. It's a question of actually participating fully in that extraordinary trans-temporal event. I've shared with you a few times a very powerful dream I had of my great-grandmother, 37 years after she died. And I'm living in Palo Alto at the time. And she died in June of 1956. And I had never dreamt of her in the interim. But in 1993, I had this really powerful dream of her. And she came into my bedroom. I was in bed asleep in my dream. And she bent down and she kissed me. And she said to me, I am. And I could make no sense of that statement. It took me about a week to figure out what she meant by saying, to me, I am. And then I got it. She was saying to me, I'm not just a dream element. I'm not just a memory from 37 years back. I'm not just a figment of your imagination. I have an existence all on my own. To me, I am. And she used that biblical phrase, I am, which is how God identifies himself, to Moses at the burning bush, and how Jesus identifies himself in John's gospel again and again and again with the I am statements. So my great-grandma was telling me, I exist. I'm out of time. I've stepped out of time. I have my own existence. And this is what Jesus is saying to us in Eucharist. When we celebrate Eucharist here, if we know how to do it, we are participating as fully in Eucharist as the members of his disciples participated in Eucharist at that stage. So it becomes very important for us to realize that. That is the great mystery of Eucharist, that we participate fully in the mystery of Eucharist. If all we're doing is remembering something that happened 2,000 years ago, then all that's happening here on a Sunday morning is that we're taking part in a very boring meal with stale bread, cheap wine, and pretended togetherness. If that's all we get out of Eucharist, we haven't understood Eucharist. So we don't understand what's really happening with Eucharist, then we don't get it. So Eucharist is this extraordinary participation, this trans-temporal participation. It is, we say at the end of the Eucharistic prayer, remember, every time you celebrate this ritual, remember that. And again, we don't understand what the word remember means. We think remember is to kind of store something in the archives so that we can access it at a later date. Remember literally means to reattach a severed limb. That's exactly what it means. Remember. Some member has been cut off in some kind of an accident, and we're now reattaching it. And that's exactly what's happening. When you really understand Eucharist, you are reattaching yourself to the body to which you really belong. And that's the body of God. Every one of us is just a manifestation of the divine. So when it says, remember that, it's not saying to us, store that someplace so that you can kind of talk about it later or kind of think about it later. It's not about that whatsoever. It is about reattaching who you really are to what really is. It's kind of grafting back the severed member. It's like somebody's working on a table saw and they cut off a finger and they rush to the emergency room and the surgeons, reattach the finger and he gets control over it and the nerve endings propagate again. That's what, remembering Eucharist is about. It is about reattaching to the body of God, of which you are a vital member. And when you reattach yourself to the body of God, you realize that all of the other limbs and all of the other extremities, all of the other fingers, all of the other toes are also part of the body of God, whether they be other human beings, whether they be friends of yours or foes of yours, or whether they're, animals of various kinds, or daffodils or dinosaurs or whatever. All of them are the Word of God made flesh. And they all need to be reattached in your living. Most of them are attached anyway, because a flower has no problem about being a flower and realizing at its own level that it is a work of God. But we differentiate ourselves, we separate ourselves from each other, we separate ourselves from God, and we separate ourselves from nature. And so remembering the ritual is about reattaching ourselves to the body from which we have become severed. And we've been severed by culture, we've been severed by religion, we've been severed by political systems, we've been severed by economic models. All these things sever us from the realization that there is only God, experiencing incarnation through every single one of us. So incarnation then becomes the opportunity to totally accept, the body I needed in order to generate the mission which I have come to fulfill. And so I want now to lead us into a kind of a guided visualization. And in this visualization, I'm going to invite everybody to try to go deeper into the understanding of the body you have, the family into which you were born, the culture of which you're a part, and the era that you chose to be birthed in this time. So that's where I will be leading. And then at the end of that, we'll have our normal, discussion, question, answer etc. So I'm inviting you to kind of sit comfortably now for a few minutes. And I invite you to close your eyes and to breathe in as deeply as feels comfortable at your own pace. And as you're breathing, I want you to remember that the breath is the interface between spirit and matter. In many, many languages, a single word can mean spirit, breath, or life. In Hebrew, we sing it many times, Ruach Yahweh, the breath of God. Ruach means spirit, it means life, it means breath. In Greek, the word is pneuma. It can mean breath, life, spirit. So we get pneumatic tires because there's air in them. In Swahili, we use the word pepo, meaning the same thing. And even in English, it sneaks in as inspiration and expiration. To inspire means to take breath in, or to take in spirit, or to be alive or creative. And to expire means to die, or to let go of spirit, or to breathe out. So the breath is the connection between spirit and matter. And as you're breathing in, you're literally recreating your body. Every single breath cycle exchanges millions of molecules of matter with the environment. And as you're breathing, I want you now to imagine that this life-giving, oxygenated blood is flowing throughout your entire body. So with the next breath, I invite you to be aware of this oxygenated blood in the soles of your feet, and in your heels and ankles and insteps. And every place it touches, it brings healing and it brings peace. And every time you breathe out now, you can let go of any discomfort or pain in that part of your body and relax. And as you breathe in again, I want you to be aware of this oxygenated life blood flowing through your shins and your calves and your knees. And every place it touches, it brings healing and it brings peace. And every time you breathe out now, you can let go of any discomfort or pain or tension in that part of your body and relax a little more deeply. And as you breathe in again, you feel this healing energy moving up into your thighs and quadriceps, up into your buttocks and pelvic area. And every place it touches, it brings healing and it brings peace. And every time you breathe out now, you can let go of any tension or pain or discomfort in that part of your body and relax even more deeply. And as you breathe in once more, you feel this healing energy moving up into your torso, up into your chest and backbone, touching all of the internal organs, your heart and lungs, liver and kidneys. And every place it touches, it brings healing and it brings peace. And every time you breathe out now, you can let go of any discomfort or pain or tension in that part of your body and relax even more deeply. And as you breathe in again, you feel this healing energy in your fingers and hands, in your wrists and forearms, in your elbows, in your biceps and triceps, right up to your shoulders. And every place it touches, it brings healing and it brings peace. And every time you breathe out now, you can let go of any discomfort or tension or pain in that part of your body and relax even more deeply. And finally, as you breathe in, you feel this healing energy moving up into your throat and neck, into your chin and jaw, into your mouth and nostrils, into your eyes and ears, up into your forehead and the sides of your head and the back of your head, right up to the crown of your head, touching all of the internal parts, your intellect, your imagination, your memory, your willpower. And every place it touches, it brings healing and it brings peace. And every time you breathe out now, you can let go of any anxiety or worry or tension in that part of your body and relax completely. And in that relaxed state, I want to take you on a little journey. I want you to imagine that you're in a beautiful meadow on a sunny day and you're barefoot. You feel the soft grass under your feet and you feel the wind on your cheek and the scent of flowers. And at the other side of the meadow you see this ancient oak tree filled with birdsong and leaves and wisdom. And you walk across towards it and you reach out your hand to touch the gnarled bark. And as you touch it, suddenly a concealed doorway opens out and you step inside. And there's a spiral stairway that wends its way downwards, deep, deep, deep into Mother Earth. But the entire area is suffused with the most extraordinary of lights, golden light that seems to embrace you. You come down the stairway and you find yourself in a little corridor. And the corridor ends with a T-section, with one section of the corridor going to your right and the other section of the corridor going to your left. And all along this corridor are doorways. And the ones to your right represent future lifetimes yet to be lived. And the ones to your left represent past lifetimes that you have finished. And in between each two doors is a special little round door that represents the bardo state, the place you go between lifetimes, between incarnations. And it's to one of those I want to direct you now. I want you to find that doorway that allows you into the bardo state, into the place you were after you had died in your last incarnation and before you incarnated in the present one. I want you to step into that bardo state. And I want you to find your mentors, your angelic guides, those who planned this and other incarnations with you and for you. And I'm going to remain completely silent for about 3 minutes. And I want you to dialogue with these mentors. And I want you to work with 4 questions. Number 1, why did I choose the body I have? Number 2, how did I choose the people, the important people in my life, family, friends, enemies? Number 3, why did I choose to be born into this culture? And number 4, why did I choose to be born into these times? So you're going to talk about your body, the people in your life, the culture you came into, and the time you were born. And if there's any particular issue that you want counsel on right now in this current incarnation, ask them about that. And I want you to thank them and realize that they're always with you. They are much more present to you and much more real than many of the physical people with whom you interact. And so at your own pace, I want you now to begin bringing your attention and your awareness back into this room and this time. And when it feels good to you, just open your eyes and we'll continue with our discussion. So what I would like us to do now is we can mix and match. We can talk about stuff in the homily that piqued your attention, or you can share some insight or some experience you had during the guided visualization, however you want to mix it and match it. Okay. Jane.
I didn't really feel like I got any great revelation from the 4 pictures, or for the 4 questions. But what I felt was that my response to it was a unified response to all of it. And what came to me is that, I don't know, I'm still processing, but it seems to me like at the meta level, we all come in with the same mission. And that mission is to take our spirit and grow it in the ways it needs to grow, so that we approach every situation in a place of emanating love.
Absolutely.
And that's kind of what came through for me. I didn't find that I had like this great mission. It was kind of like just to be in love. Great. Does that fit?
That's perfect. 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 Tom.
So, Sean, I think I have enough information to be dangerous, but so I've often thought that, you know, if Jesus was at the altar today, he'd be sitting there saying, "Don't worship me."
Yes.
And there's another phrase, sort of, go out and put on the mind of Christ.
Yes.
And so then I loved your homily, and I'm sort of sitting there saying, I mean, can I accept the fact that I have the same divinity as Jesus had?
Yes.
And it's interesting timing, because I wanted to win the homily auction.
Okay.
And in there, I wanted you to speak on the divinity of Jesus relative to today. So anyway, a couple of comments on those would be appreciated.
Sure, absolutely. Good. So you didn't win it, so I'm going to just truncate my remarks. Okay. And then I get back to Mark. And so again and again and again, all the great avatars point out to us that, you know, everything except God is illusory if we take it to be kind of pristine reality. It's not that we're not real here. It's not that our physicality isn't real. It is. But it's a very, in some senses, unimportant level of reality. Its importance consists only in the realization that it is by working with limitations that we transcend and learn to grow more and more deeply. But ultimately, this is God having all these experiences. And so the divinity of Christ consists in his awakening to that realization. And so Hinduism uses the phrase self-realization, but they use the self with a capital S. They're not talking about ego. The self is the core essence, which is God stuff. So self-realization is the cognitive shift that happens when somebody becomes enlightened and they get it, there is only God. And I'm a bite-sized piece of God having a human experience. I'm one of the bees in God's hive going out, bringing back pollen to the group and stories to the group. And so the only difference between Jesus and the rest of us is that he was self-realized. He got it, that he was a child of God. And he kept saying to people, the same things I do, you will do, because I'll send you the Spirit. Or have that mindset in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. Or, as you say, another phrase, putting on the mind of Christ. The Buddha got there, although the Buddha didn't talk about a divinity per se, but he talked about understanding the core essence of the self. So there are many different words for it. You can call it Christ consciousness, you can call it Buddha nature, you can call it Krishna consciousness, you can call it enlightenment, you can call it self-realization. They're all just words pointing to the place that some people arrive at where they really get it, that there is only God. And that every single one of us is just an expression of that. And therefore, if I know that I'm an expression of God, and that everything I encounter is an expression of God, there can't be any prejudice. There can't be any anger. There can't be any jealousy, any more than does my hand get jealous because the apple it picked is eaten by my mouth and digested by my stomach? Of course not. Because the metabolic process that results from what the stomach does to it benefits the hand as well. So the eye sees the apple, the legs walk there, the hand plucks it, the mouth chews it, the stomach digests it, and the whole body benefits. And so that's what real compassion is about, the realization that there is only God. Everything that exists is an expression of God, including my enemies. And when Christ says, love your enemies, he's not saying, lie down and be a carpet, let them walk over you. He says, do you not realize that that's just another expression of God? And it's there to help you to grow and to overcome limitations. And so the divinity that Christ realized was not a special to Jesus, the second person of the Blessed Trinity. That's a terrible understanding. The second person of the Blessed Trinity is just God's self-knowledge. And the Trinity, the third person, is, the love that God has for whom she knows herself to be. But this notion that there's a second person of the Blessed Trinity, and he became a human being, and it's Jesus Christ of Nazareth, let's all bow down and worship this guy. That's exactly what Jesus did not want. Yeah. Mark, you are next.
If, in fact, we are all bite-sized pieces of God having a human experience, what leads some of us to murder children and commit heinous crimes and genocide and all manner of really bad inhumanity to man?
Okay, great. That's a great question, Mark. It's the greatest theological question of all. It's called theodicy, why bad things happen. And my understanding is that from God emanate bite-sized pieces, but these bite-sized pieces have to evolve. They're separated splinters of consciousness, but they literally have to start from scratch. In the very same way that every one of us, including the baby, the baby Jesus is born, and soiled his diapers. All he could do was burp and suckle, and he couldn't even turn himself over in the cot. And so every single one of us, no matter how self-realized we might become in our 60s or 80s or 90s or whatever, we're all going to start off, not being able to stand, not being able to walk, not being able to talk, not being able to think rationally. We have to step ourselves through those stages of the evolution of what it means to be an incarnated being. And the same thing is true for a soul. And so there are very young souls that come in and they immediately get overpowered by the temptations of the flesh, whether it's to sensuality or whether it's to greed or whether it's to kind of power. Hinduism says there are three great temptations. The first one is sensuality. And they said there's nothing wrong with sensuality, as long as it's tempered. The second one is power, wanting to privilege, prestige, power. And Hinduism says there's nothing wrong with power if it's exercised properly. And the third one is being of service to others. And even that's predicated on the notion of separation. I can't be of service to somebody unless they're separate from me. And that itself is an illusion. And the fourth stage is called moksha, the realization there is only one of us. And so individual souls, in order to step themselves through into the full realization, have to start, as little infants, spiritual infants. And they come into a world, and they create a situation which looks terrible. But the truth is, if there were no pain in our world, if there were no suffering in our world, if there were no prejudice in our world, nobody would be growing. It is the tension between the light and the dark that moves us from free will into freedom and from self-concern into compassion. If we lived in a totally perfect world, empathy and compassion would atrophy on the vine. So in some extraordinary way, it is also part of the divine plan that there be darkness and evil. But in one sense, there is no evil. And again, all the great avatars say this. Shakespeare will say, there is nothing either good nor bad. But thinking makes it so. We impose categories on it. Rumi has a great poem that says, out beyond right doing and beyond wrong doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. So there's nothing in our world which isn't grist for the mill of our growth. Even the bad stuff is necessary in order for us to develop compassion and to develop freedom. So it depends on which level of perspective we choose to take. I've used this example many times. If I could bring my consciousness down to a cellular level, my entire epidermis is covered with dead skin cells. In fact, 50% of the dust in your home is dead skin cells that's fallen off your body. So if I could bring my consciousness down to that level, my body would look like the day after World War III began. But there's a contract between the epidermis and the internal organs. The epidermis creates a shield to protect the inner organs from ultraviolet radiation. And so these dead skin cells perform a hugely important function in protecting the inner organs against ultraviolet radiation. And so when you take it from the meta perspective, the dead skin cells are part of the arrangement to keep this life form vital. And the same thing is true of the evil or the darkness. I'm not saying we advocate for these kinds of things, but the system has evolved in such a way that anybody who is serious about growing into compassion or growing into freedom will position themselves in planets or in dimensions where darkness and light are equally balanced. If you want an easy ride, there's other places to go to where there is no darkness and there is no evil. It may be great vacation time, but you won't grow a whole lot there. You won't be tested. Okay. Johanna was next. You okay? Okay. Jenny, sorry. We'll go Debla first and then go back to Jane, because Jim. Yeah.
Thank you for this. What came to me is something that I've been working on now for several weeks and weeks and weeks, and that's the concept of, in order to be able to extend love, to extend compassion and kindness, we need to start first at home and realize that compassion and love and kindness begins with ourselves, and to embrace our own divinity. Mm. And coming here, we come into an illusion where we are sold a bill of goods, so to speak, that it's all out there, and it's more important for me to extend compassion to someone else, and it doesn't really matter how I treat myself, when it's truly the opposite. And we aren't given tools, it seems, until far down along the journey to realize that we are truly divine. And the ego's trap is to do, it seems, all we can to renounce our own divinity. And then one day the light comes on, and we see that we are truly a bite-sized piece of God. And there's a movie that I saw many, many, many years ago, and this line has stayed with me for such a long time. And it goes something like this: what once was sundered and undone is now made whole. The two are one.
Beautiful.
And in what you were reminding us about today, it's in the remembering, because how truly can we help another remember unless we have the courage to remember ourselves?
Absolutely. Brilliant. It's beautiful, Deborah. Beautiful. So there's a great Latin proverb that says, "Nemo dat quod non habet." Nobody can give out what they don't contain. You can't give that which you don't have. And so if there isn't compassion within the system for the self, it can't be given to others. So when Jesus says, love your neighbor as you love yourself, if you're not loving yourself and you're loving your neighbor in the way in which you're not loving yourself, then you're not loving your neighbor either. And so it's like announcement that comes in an airplane on the occasion of a sudden loss of cabin pressure, oxygen mask will drop from the ceiling. First put on your own mask before you attempt to help anybody else, because you have literally about 90 seconds of oxygen before you're going to collapse. And so that's true in life as well. The important distinction then is that we don't think that the self is the ego. And so the ego wants to hoard all the goodies. The self only needs the resources available for mission. And that's the huge difference. But the self does need the resources for mission. And this is what Christ teaches us in the Our Father. Give us this day our daily bread. Whatever resources we need for the mission, give them to us. But then once the self has the resources, it realizes the resources are there in order to extend this love to others. What the ego thinks is, the ego is a hoarder. There's never enough money in the bank, or there's never enough food in the fridge, or whatever. So the ego wants to keep hoarding. So it's not self-love, it's egoic narcissism. Yeah. And Jane.
Okay, so Deborah kind of touched a little bit on where I was going, but 3 things occurred to me while you were talking about that. And one is that the people whom Jesus healed weren't the Pharisees and the scribes or those who were empowered. They were, because they had a pretty good life. He healed the miserable people, the people who were sick or the outcasts. And when they were healed, he said, "Your faith has saved you," or whatever he said, in that line. And so it seems to me that within, I always go back to Hitler as the ultimate evil, but there's been other really horrible, really evil people in the world. It seems to me that even within that person, there still is the kernel of God. And so what you said about Shakespeare, it almost seems like, what you think is what makes it so, how I perceive that person. If I don't claim to be able to do that, but if I can approach even someone like a mass murderer or someone filled with racial hatred from a space of love, which, as you said, isn't laying down and being a doormat, then that can be the same transformation that Jesus created in other people in terms of emanating to emanate that energy into the world would be of benefit to the world, it would seem to me.
Right. Absolutely. You're absolutely right, Jim, because you can't either brutalize people into love or you can't legislate people into love. You can only invite people into love by the energy you put out, and you may have to suffer in the process. And certainly society needs to protect itself, and individuals need to protect themselves, but there are levels of protection, and there are defenses which are over the top, and we live in a world in which the vast bulk of our resources are dedicated, to aggression or allegedly protecting national security. And we do this as individuals as well. And so it becomes really, really important to radiate levels of love, around us. So I love this Buddhist meditation, May I be free from all harm, may I be truly happy, may I be healthy and strong, may I be in alignment with God. And then I extend it to a friend, and then to a teacher, and then to a neutral person, like the mailman, or to a difficult person, whoever is difficult right now for me, and then to all living beings. So that we need to become kind of mobile tabernacles of radiating love. That's what Christ was, that's what the avatars are. Mobile tabernacles of radiating love. And that's the best way of all of turning an enemy into a friend. You're not going to brutalize an enemy, into loving you, or legislate people into loving you. So the first refuge of fear is always legislation, law, either creating it, or submitting to it. And love is the most liberating force on planet Earth, but it costs not less than everything. All of you have to be dedicated to it. So is it Tom? And then Karen.
Yes, maybe this is just a follow-up on it. But for example, when you had your sessions on how was the world working, we would look at the pharmaceutical industry and what the good things they're doing, but also what they were doing in the name of greed and profit. And you would say we have to change it,
Yes,
but we have to do it with love.
absolutely.
Intellectually, I totally agree with you. No issue. But if you want to mobilize people, the easiest way apparently, maybe it's, I'm not sure it works, but you say, look what they're doing, go out and demonstrate. Look what happened at Oklahoma University, march against those people and have hate of them. How can they do those things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we do know that doesn't work. But I'm not, while I believe the only path is love, other than praying in my own home, in my own room, which I do quite a bit. But it's so hard to think, if I want to mobilize people to overcome some injustice, how I can do that with love energy rather than with fear energy, which is what comes over the intermail all the time. Donate to this cause or that cause, etc. So all I can say is, yeah, it's the right way, but I don't understand. I understand why I shouldn't do it the other way. I'm not, other than praying in my own room, I don't really understand how to make that real out in the world and get something done.
That's a great question, Tom. So the first thing I would say is that the fastest way to overcome an unjust regime is through violence. But it creates no transformation. It's just establishing violence as a way of getting your end, your agenda. And I've seen this in Africa again and again and again, that when you get an unjust, dictatorial regime, that it's overthrown by some kind of a rebel outfit, the rebels get in charge, and they're just as dictatorial as the other guys. So it's the fastest way to make change is violence, but it never affects transformation. And so part of what we have to realize is that in our confrontation of injustice, and we need to do it, and I'll address that in a few moments, in our confrontation of injustice, we need to realize that it has to be God's way and God's timing. And we may not see the end of an unjust regime in our lifetime. And that's the ego. The ego wants to see it done now and my way. And if we have the courage to do it God's way, it may not happen in my lifetime. And it may not, follow the route I would have wanted it to follow. So we have to have the courage to contribute what can contribute, and let God decide the timing of it and the route it's going to take. Now, having said that, we can't just, it's not just about prayer. A few weeks ago I gave a lecture, a homily on prayer, and I suggested that prayer had 6 components. That it had to come from a clean heart. You can't have effective prayer. You can't change any system if you're coming out of an unclean heart, a place of prejudice or anger or anxiety or depression or fear. So you have to clean your own heart first. The second one is you have to be filled with compassion, because all these people, the pharmaceutical people, the dictators of the world, they're all bite-sized pieces of God as well. So they have to be made part of the solution rather than just the problem. The third thing is there has to be a laserized intentionality, not just the odd thought about something. There has to be a laserized intention. The fourth thing is there has to be real effort. Yeah, you got to, do something about it, practically speaking. The fifth piece is, what I'm hoping for has to be in alignment with the divine order or the natural progress of the evolutionary trajectory of the cosmos. And number 6, I have to trust in the process and realize it's going to happen at God's timing. Now, as we confront, and to take that one segment of your point, I said to you many times that there are 4 kinds of love that I can see. I call them the 4 C's. There's the love of kind of commendation. There's the love of, complementarity. There's the love of compensation, and there's the love of confrontation. So you can love somebody by, saying, way done, well done, great job, way to go. That's a way of loving somebody. It's commending them for their efforts. There's a way of loving people which is about complementarity, that there's a job to be done. Not everybody has all the skills to do it, and so each of us takes a part of the burden, and we love each other by taking different roles in this movement. That's love by complementarity. There's love by compensation, where, a colleague, drops the ball, and instead of condemning the colleague, I pick it up, and I do an extra piece of the work. That's a way of loving somebody. And there's the fourth way is confrontation. Somebody's really screwing up, like the pharmaceutical industry or whatever. I need to be able to come right up against them. But even as I oppose them with tremendous strength and with great intelligence, as Jesus did with the Pharisees, it's always done out of love. His anger is never an irrational, egoic response to frustration. It's always used as a tool of intended transformation. Just like the Zen Buddhist teacher, when somebody is fast asleep, like Bernadette here, and he comes around and he hits her on the shoulder with a stick. He's not done doing that because he's really angry with her. He's waking her up. And so the confrontation has to be done as with the intentionality of transformation of the other, not of, just getting rid of my own frustration or anger at you. Yeah, Georgie.
Courtney said one thing about all anger is based on
Start again.
all anger is based on hurt, fear, and frustration.
So we'll George and then Karen, sorry, and then we'll stop. Start again, please, George.
All anger is based on hurt, fear, and frustration. As long as I'm in the anger, I'm out there and I can't do a darn thing about it. I got to get in here. And no matter how justified that anger is, it hurts. I lose, they win. And Jesus on the cross said, Father, forgive them.
Exactly.
And I propose that what he did is he freed himself of any pain that he had inside.
I love that, George. So there's a line in our Eucharistic prayer of the Cosmos that says that even at the darkest stage of that incarnation, that's when he instituted Eucharist. So when he was at his lowest, it's the night before he died, he's at the Last Supper, washing the feet of somebody who's going to betray him for 30 pieces of silver, and he knows that. He's in the garden where he has what I can only describe as a panic attack. It's so bad, he's literally sweating blood. And next day, he's going to be tortured physically, emotionally, and even existentially. At some stage, he's going to come to the conclusion that this was a cruel hoax, that there is no God, there is no Father. He's been totally abandoned. He's wasted his life, on this, a goose chase, and it's all a crock. A total existential meltdown. And in the middle of all that, he can say, Father, forgive them. They have no idea what they're doing. So that becomes every one of us is going to reach those dark places. And the question then becomes, when I reach those dark places, is there a reservoir of love which is deeper than my darkness, out of which I can operate? Because that's what he did. In the darkest hour, he creates Eucharist, he washes his disciples' feet, including the guy who's going to sell him down. He's going to have a panic attack, he's going to have an existential crisis, he's going to be in tremendous physical discomfort, he's going to watch his mother suffering, and he's going to suffer even more because his mother is suffering. And in the middle of all of that, he can say, Father, forgive them, they have no idea what they're doing. Because they don't. Nobody who hurts another human person wouldn't be doing it if they really knew what they were doing. The ego may have an agenda, but if the soul really knew, the effects of its actions, it would never engage in any kind of cruel or angry behavior. So the question then becomes, in our darkest times, and we all have darkest times, is there a place deeper than my darkness? Is there a reservoir of love deeper than the darkness from which I can draw and respond even in those times? We'll finish with Karen's comment.
So I have a couple of things, but just to comment on what you just said, is that to me is the beauty of the meta prayer.
Okay.
Because that's where you hit the reservoir that's different,
Okay.
no matter what your ego is telling you.
Right.
So in this meditation piece, for me, my focus mostly was why now?
Okay.
What is it about this time?
Okay.
And it seems to me because of the technology now and because of the internet now, the two things are being thrown up for us. We can either see this with the pied beauty that Gerard Manley Hopkins talks about of creation and people and their diversity, or we can look at all of that and say, they're different from me, and that's scary. So it becomes that if what we're really trying to recognize is that we are a bite-sized piece of God, that we're all one piece. What do I have to do personally to connect with all of those things? And it seems like what I have to do is there's a lot of push on personal development in order to allow myself to be vulnerable enough to actually connect. Because it just, if you can't make connection unless you kind of are willing to do that.
Right. So I make one final comment on the why now part of it as well. I really believe that there comes a time in the evolutionary trajectory of every planet in which there are significant shifts going to happen in consciousness. And so, for instance, for the longest period of time, for over 4 billion years on this planet, it was the evolution of consciousness. It was being driven by the spirit itself, without much participation by the people involved. With the advent of Homo sapiens sapiens, there's an extraordinary shift from the evolution of consciousness to conscious evolution. For the first time ever, as far as we know, there are beings on the planet who can participate in this evolutionary trajectory, slow it down, or accelerate it. So there's this extraordinary opportunity in our times of making this quantum leap from, if you want to call it a fourth dimensional reality, to a fifth dimensional reality, from a kind of a physical greed-based, notion to a Christ consciousness understanding. And so souls are flocking in, because this is where the action is on planet Earth, in our times. But except most of us are asleep at the wheel. So we come down because we know this is exciting and we can be part of this shift in consciousness. But most of us then wind up fast asleep and just contributing to the kind of the sleep rather than contributing to the awakening. Guys, thank you so much for your patience.